Hey, what's going on, everybody, fans of the GBA? My name is Monatui, your host for the GBA Season 5, Week 12 weekly recap, the final weekly recap of GBA Season 5. I hope you guys are excited. Of course, I am not alone. I am with my co-host, Slyro. Sly, please introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? Slyro here, of course, joining Monatui again for the weekly recaps for the GBA.
Yes, this recap will be a little bit towards the end. You'll see as we get there. But we're going to start it off just like we would any other week. So to start off this week's matches, we are unfortunately going to have to cover forfeiture. This week, Miguel has forfeited his match against Mulvone and the Cincinnati Loudreds. I am not 100% aware of the reason. I'm sure Miguel has his reason. I'm sure he put it up on Twitter somewhere, but it is what it is. Miguel forfeited his match against Mulvone. However, these two will face off relatively soon in the first week of the playoffs.
So the first game that we do have to talk about is going to be the game between Lars and the Borussia Donphan versus Gio and the San Francisco GIENTEIS. So Lars leads off with Luxray as Gio decides to lead off with his Blissey. Fearing that the Luxray could have superpower, Gio did switch out as Lars sees that and just goes for the Volt Switch on the Amoonguss that comes in and goes into his Crobat, knowing that he can go for Brave Bird and it will do a lot of damage. So Gio sends in Ditto to kind of see what the Crobat set is and takes a critical hit from the Brave Bird. Doesn't kill it, but it comes very, very close. So Gio then just goes for U-turn with the Ditto as Lars roosts up back to full. And Lars switches out into Slowking and Gio just hits it with a Toxic. And then Lars makes a double into Crobat as Gio switches into his Amoonguss. So Crobat proving to be a big threat as Crobat then hits Latias with a Brave Bird, but isn't enough to 2-hit KO it as it deals a bit under half. Latias reveals Roost as Lars goes into the Slowking, and then reveals Calm Mind as Lars then decides to go into Azumarill. Latias then switches out into Amoonguss as it takes a lot of damage from Ice Punch on the Azumarill, but does reveal the Rocky Helmet, so Azumarill takes some damage from the Rocky Helmet. Lars then decides to go for another Ice Punch and deals a little over 20% with Ice Punch and freezes Entei, which basically means that Gio has to go for a Sacred Fire to melt the ice, which is what he does, and hits the incoming Slowking with that Sacred Fire. Lars then crits the incoming Amoonguss with Scald, but doesn't get the burn. And then Slowking switches out into the Crobat as Gio goes back into his Ditto. And then the Ditto just U-turns as Lars roosts, same thing as before, predicting the potential Brave Bird. Gio goes into Entei. Lars just U-turns into his Landorus Eye, predicting the Stone Edge, a prediction that he does get right. And then as Gio switches out into the Latias, Lars gets his Rocks up with the Landorus, so Rocks are up. But not for very long, as the Latias does then reveal Defog as Lars goes into his Slowking. Means that it only has one attack. Lars is pretty sure that the one attack is going to be Dragon Stab, and risking this, he does make the switch into Azumarill. So thinking that he can bring in Azumarill every single time the Latias comes out. He just goes for another Ice Punch as Amoonguss does come back in and almost kills it, but not quite. The same switch happens again as Gio then switches into Entei as Azumarill just goes for another Ice Punch. And kind of the same cycle of switches going out here as Lars then switches out into Slowking. Slowking does tank his Sacred Fire from the Entei and then goes for a Psyshock as the Amoonguss comes in, and the Amoonguss does go down to the Psyshock from Slowking. Then Gio brings in Ditto and gets the Regenerator from the Slowking and then switches right into Latias as Lars goes into his Luxray. Just goes for the Volt Switch again and still feeling like he can get a free switch into Azumarill every time. Does do that. And Latias roosts up as Azumarill does go for the Play Rough. Gio didn't have anything to take it, so the Latias does go down to that Play Rough. Blissey comes in, and Lars, feeling that something is up, switches out into Landorus as Gio reveals Fling Flame Orb Blissey. So that was really cool to see, and that does burn the Landorus Eye, which wasn't a huge deal for Lars. Lars just sets up rocks with the Lando, and then Ditto comes in on Gio's side and just kills that Landorus with a knockoff. But then Azumarill comes back in, and Blissey goes down to 2 waterfalls from Azumarill. Azumarill just safe go for waterfall and does damage to a lot of what Gio had left. The Mega Pinsir does come in, and Lars knows he has to sack something, and he chooses to sack Delphox as the Mega Pinsir goes for return. Luxray comes in, knows he outspeeds because he's Scarfed, can Volt Switch, and Geo switches out into his Entei, takes a Volt Switch as Lars goes into his Crobat. Ditto comes in and U-turns as Lars Brave Birds and then kills the Ditto comes back in and Brave Birds, but it dies to the recoil, and that gives Lars the 4-0 victory.
Yes, as we mentioned last week, this match had some pretty important playoff contention. If Geo won, he was guaranteed the playoff spot, but he did unfortunately lose to Lars. Lars prepped and played extremely well. He made sure that he did not make the same mistakes as last time, making sure that he didn't give Pinsir the proper chance to set up. Even if Pinsir did set up, he had his Scarf Luxray in the back that could easily take it on. Some of the prep by Geo was a little bit weird, being the mono-attacking Dragon Pulse Latias, which was completely 100% walled by the Azumarill, but that is how the game finished up. A 4-0 victory to Lars and the Borussia Donphan, and once we go into Dan's match a little bit later, you'll see how this match played out as far as playoffs are concerned. So moving on to the next match, we have the match between the Atlanta Howluches, coached by Fizz, and the New York Mankeys, coached by Shady Penguin. Fizz brought his Garchomp, Tyranitar, Mega Charizard Y, Heliolisk, Venomoth, and Togekiss. Shady brought Sharpedo, Mega Venusaur, Rotom Heat, Melodic, Jirachi, and Alakazam. So, to start off the match, Fizz creeps out all of his viewers by whispering weirdly into the mic. After that, getting into the battle, Fizz leads with his Tyranitar as Shady leads with his Rotom Heat. Shady decides to T-Wave the Tyranitar as Tyranitar sets up its Stealth Rocks, kind of ballsy on Shady's part, but it did work out for him. Rotom then Volt switches out into his Melodic as the Tyranitar deals decent damage to the Melodic with the combination of Dark Pulse, Sand, and the Stealth Rocks. Fizz then goes out into Heliolisk, which would be a perfect switch-in if it had Dry Skin, but Fizz is bringing Solar Power this week in combination with the Charizard Y, so it is hit relatively hard by the Scald. Does not get burned, and afterwards goes for the Volt Switch the following turn on the Melodic, and predicting the Mirror Coat, Fizz goes out into his Tyranitar, because obviously Mirror Coat does not work against the Dark type. However, Melodic just goes for the Recover, bringing itself back to a good amount of HP. After this turn, Fizz goes out into his Venomoth and goes for a Sleep Powder on the Melodic, which is very good for Fizz because he can potentially set up and deal with things on Shady's team. Fizz then goes for the Bug Buzz on the incoming Jirachi, dealing a little bit under half, which is still good because Jirachi is a very big annoyance to his team. Even if it does not have the best matchup, it still can just hacks you to death, so weakening that is very important for him. Jirachi then, however, sets up its Stealth Rocks on the Garchomp switch-in on Fizz's side. Garchomp then clicks Earthquake on the Melodic switch-in and is easily able to two-shot the Melodic. Even though Melodic is very bulky, this is a choice banded Garchomp and is able to deal massive damage. Shady's Mega Venusaur is going to come in. Fizz decides to go out into his Togekiss as potential sleep fodder, as Venusaur goes for the knockoff instead, knocking off the Togekiss's leftovers. Shady then, not wanting to take an Air Slash, goes out into his Rotom Heat, and does in fact take the Air Slash very well. Shady is then going to go for the HP Ice with his Rotom Heat, potentially predicting the Garchomp to come in, as T-Tar comes instead and tanks the HP Ice very easily. Rotom then Volt switches out into the Mega Venusaur, all the while Fizz makes a very excellent Nupun that I do commend him for. So similar events occur here that happen to the Melodic. Venusaur is going to switch in, and does take decent damage from the Stealth Rocks in combination with the Sand, as well as the Dark Pulse damage done by the Tyranitar. Venomoth is then going to come in on Fizz's side, trying to potentially set up a Quiver Dance. However, it is unfortunately put to sleep by the Mega Venusaur, meaning that it is not going to be able to do too much. Garchomp is then going to come in, and actually takes the Hidden Power Flying coming from Shady's Mega Venusaur, good prep on his part. And then Fizz makes a little bit of a silly play, goes for the Outrage onto the Venusaur, which is able to clean take it out from where it was at. However, Jirachi is going to come in, reveals that it was Choice Scarfed all along, Choice Scarfed with Stealth Rocks, and is able to kill off the Garchomp with an Ice Punch. Fizz does try to capitalize on this, however. He goes out into his Mega Charizard Y, takes the Stealth Rock damage. Shady stays in with his Jirachi and does not kill with an Ice Punch, and Jirachi is absolutely obliterated by a Fire Blast, and it does go down. However, the momentum does shift into Shady's side here, as he does go out into his Alakazam and sets up a substitute, as Fizz unfortunately misses a Fire Blast. Then, the Mega Charizard Y is going to die to a Psychic from the Alakazam. However, Fizz does have a backup plan in his sleeve. He goes out into the Heliolisk, and with the Solar Power, he is able to clean knock out the Alakazam with Hyper Voice from behind the Substitute, because sound-based moves are able to hit from behind the Substitute, and the Alakazam clean goes down. After this turn, however, Shady does go out into his Sharpedo, goes for the Protect to get the speed boost, trying to outspeed the Heliolisk, and goes for a second Protect, making sure that he can outspeed the Heliolisk because it has revealed to be Scarfed, and he does get it. This pretty much seals up the rest of the game for Fizz. There's absolutely nothing on Fizz's team that can take a hit from Sharpedo at this point. Because of that double Protect, he is going to outspeed the Scarfed Heliolisk, and clean takes it out with Waterfall. He's able to knock out the Sleeping Venomoth in one hit. He's able to knock out the Togekiss with Ice Fang, and it just clean sweeps the rest of Shady's team. And that is pretty much the end of the game.
Yeah, this is a very nice back and forth game with a lot of interesting plays, and at the end, Shady just tested his luck, and his luck was really on his side there at the end. You know, the double Protect, the Fire Blast miss. Shady was just meant to win at the end, and they both made really good plays, and it was really entertaining to see. So the next game that we're going to go over is going to be Dan and the St. Louis Rampardos against Tup and the Pittsburgh Pirattatas. So for this game, Tup leads with his Thunderous Eye as Dan leads with the Golurk. And as we've seen in previous weeks, the Thunderous Eye does not last very long, as Tup does go for the Grass Knot, as Dan then just goes for the Stone Edge, which does hit because of the No Guard. It's guaranteed to hit, and does one-hit KO the Thunderous Eye. So Tup then decides to bring in the Celebi and goes for Psychic on the incoming Victini that Dan switched in, and Celebi reveals that it is Life Orb. Tup then switches out into Arcanine on that Victini, and Victini just U-turns out and goes into the Salamence. Tup then brings in his T-Tar as the Salamence goes for a sub. Knowing that he can't let the Salamence just set up, Tyranitar does live the Brick Break that Salamence went for, and hits it back with an Ice Beam, breaking that sub. Tup then decides to stay in with the Tyranitar, again not wanting the Salamence to set up. Salamence just kills it with a Dragon Claw and gets Moxie Boost, so that's Tyranitar down. So Arcanine gets a clean switch in, gets the Intimidate off to take away that Moxie Boost. And Dan just switches into the Blastoise. Tup then decides to switch into the Celebi on the Blastoise, as it does get Toxic. Celebi then kills the incoming Golurk that Dan sends in with Earth Power. Dan just kind of wanted to scout, see what it had, and then Jolteon comes in knowing you can outspeed the Celebi, and does kill it with a Signal Beam, which was really nice to see. Tup then gets a clean switch into his Excadrill, and lives an HP fighting that the Jolteon was packing, and then just kills it with an Earthquake. But it does take a lot of damage, putting it at really low health. So then Dan brings in the Salamence, but then pulls a double switch into the Blastoise, predicting Arcanine to come in, which he was corrected predicting. Then Arcanine does burn the Blastoise, as Blastoise goes for Scald, but does less than half to the Arcanine. Arcanine then heals up with Morning Sun, as Dan Scalds again, this time doing slightly more than half, so it's always doing around that half damage. Dan then switches into Aggron as Arcanine just decides to heal up again, just going to keep doing the same thing, keep it itself as high as health as possible. Then goes for Will-O-Wisp, but misses it on the Aggron, as Dan is able to Mega up the Aggron and set up Stealth Rocks. Tup just tries to go for another Will-O-Wisp, and this time hits and burns the Aggron, as Dan goes for Toxic, and Toxics the Arcanine. Tup then hits the Mega Aggron with Flare Blitz, and tanks the Stone Edge, doing not that much damage. But then Tup decides to make a switch into Excadrill, and Dan makes a switch and goes into Blastoise. Blastoise then Aqua Jets Excadrill, but doesn't do that much to Excadrill thanks to the burn that it got on earlier, and was hit really hard by an Earthquake, which I believe was Choice Banded Excadrill. Tup then hard switches into Arcanine and tanks an Aqua Jet due to, Intimidate, Leftovers, Burn, so the Aqua Jet's really just not doing much at all. Tup then decides just to Morning Sun as Dan goes back into his Mega Aggron. Tup just Morning Suns as Aggron does not that much damage to Arcanine, but Arcanine is toxic, and it is starting to rack up some toxic damage. And then Tup just Morning Suns again as Dan goes for Stone Edge, but this time misses. And this time Dan decides to bring in Victini as Tup decides to go for a Flare Blitz. It does a little bit of damage, but it is Victini, so doesn't really do much. And then Tup's Arcanine does go down to toxic damage. Dan then tries to sack Mega Aggron, but Kyurem misses the Draco Meteor, and Aggron dies to the burn. Victini comes in and V-creates the Kyurem and the Excadrill to finish the game, giving Dan the 3-0 victory.
Yeah, so again, like we mentioned earlier, this was also a very important match in terms of who was making the playoff. After Gio lost 4-0 to Lars, Dan essentially had to win 3-0 or greater in order to achieve a playoff spot, and he did just get that exact 3-0. Basically, if Dan got a 2-0, they would have been tied in differential. However, Gio would have been given the playoff spot because in a personal matchup between these two, Gio did win. Playoffs are determined by first your win-loss record, then your differential, and then your head-to-head matchup. Dan winning 3-0 was absolutely huge for him. You can see at the end of his narration, he was extremely excited that he had achieved the playoff spot. Just a fun fact really quick, toward the end of the match, Tup had his Kyurem in on a Victini, and Tup had lost at that point regardless, but if Tup had switched into his Excadrill on the V-Create, and then come back in with Kyurem, he would have outsped the Victini with his Kyurem, and could have easily killed something else on Dan's team, because nothing on his team could really take a hit from the Kyurem. Had he done that, Dan would have only won 2-0, and we would be seeing Gio in the playoffs, but that is how the match ended out, so congratulations to Dan, and good season to Tup as well. Moving on, we have the match between the Arizona Deoxys, coached by Gubbs, and the Boston Red Sox, coached by Nick. Gubbs brought his Lucario, Snorlax, Tentacruel, Zoroark, Cofagrigus, and Thundurus T, whereas Nick brought his Manaphy, Tyrantrum, Nidoking, Cresselia, Mienshao, and Skarmory. So to start off the match, Nick is going to lead with his Nidoking as Gubbs lead with his Cofagrigus. Gubbs does not want to take any hit from this, so he switches out into his Air Balloon Tentacruel as Nidoking sets up a substitute, and then, in order to break the balloon, Nick reveals the Focus Punch on the Nidoking, which is really cool to see, Sub-Focus Punch Nidoking, which deals about a third of Tentacruel's HP and does break its balloon, as the Tentacruel does just break the sub with a Surf. Nick then switches out into his Skarmory, which takes another Surf from the Tentacruel. Tentacruel, once again, goes for a Surf, as Skarmory actually Brave Birds, bringing Tentacruel relatively low. Nick, predicting another Surf, which is what ends up happening, goes out into his Manaphy, which does take the hit relatively well, of course, it being a bulky Manaphy, being resisted. Tentacruel, however, then reveals to be faster than the Manaphy and deals about 50% with Giga Drain. I believe the determining factor in Tentacruel being faster was that Manaphy did not have any EVs, so that's a pretty interesting thing to note. Manaphy is then able to knock out the Tentacruel with the Psychic, but enough damage has been done onto the Manaphy to please Gubbs. So after this, Gubbs is going to send in his Zoroark, which is disguised as a Snorlax, and clicks Sludge Bomb on an incoming Skarmory. Of course, Skarmory is immune, but is then knocked out by the following Dark Pulse. Mienshao is then going to come in, and is going to click U-turn as Gubbs switches into his Cofagrigus, which obtains the Mummy ability, meaning that the 10% taken from Life Orb will not be regenerated. Nidoking is then going to come in with Cofagrigus and hits it with an Earth Power, as Cofagrigus retaliates with a Shadow Ball, dealing decent damage to the Nidoking. After this, Snorlax is going to come in on Nidoking's Ice Beam and takes it very well due to Snorlax's extremely good bulk as well as potentially thick fat. This is the point where the lead really goes into Gubbs' favor. Snorlax is going to go for a return on the Cresselia, which takes it very easily. Nick is then going to pull a double into his Tyrantrum as Gubbs goes out into his Zoroark. Nick reveals to be a Scarf Tyrantrum, but unfortunately misses the Head Smash, which easily would have OHKO'd the Zoroark. And unfortunately for Nick, the Tyrantrum does go down to a Life Orb Dark Pulse, followed by a Sucker Punch from the Zoroark. Nick then goes out into his Mienshao and is hit by a crit Sucker Punch before killing the Zoroark with the U-turn. Didn't end up mattering too much in the end, but the crit is unfortunate. Mienshao was a very big win condition for him. Nick is then going to bring out the Nidoking as Gubbs sends in his Lucario, which is able to outspeed and knock it out with a Flash Cannon. Mienshao is going to come in for Gubbs and is hit by a Vacuum Wave from the Lucario, which puts it in range of Life Orb. So I said earlier, the crit didn't matter too much. It actually did, because the crit Sucker Punch meant that after a Vacuum Wave, the Mienshao would go down to another Life Orb hit, meaning even if he went for U-turn, he would have died before he switched out, therefore not getting Regenerator. So like I just said, both Pokemon go down. Thundurus comes in for Gubbs, Cresselia for Nick. Thundurus then Volt switches out onto the Cresselia and goes out into a Snorlax, and at this point Snorlax can basically just start setting up and win the game. Cresselia then goes for a Lunar Dance, bringing Manaphy back to full health as the Snorlax goes for a Curse. Manaphy is going to come in, but is unable to kill the Snorlax, and Snorlax kills Manaphy with 3 returns. Would have been 2 returns, but unfortunately the Snorlax was burned on the second Scald. Not that it's a huge deal, and Gubbs is going to pull away with the 3-0 victory over the Boston Red Sox.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this match didn't have any huge playoff implications or anything, but it was still a really fun match to see. Of course, things like Focus Punch Nidoking are also great to see, and it was also just good to see Gubbs ending off his season with a win. Yeah, that was really good overall. And speaking of fun matches, we're going to be talking about George and the San Francisco Arcanines versus Hayden and the Sacramento SEAKINGS. Both these teams basically deciding to bring some fun teams and to just have a lot of fun, and that is indeed what happens. So, George leads with his Nidoqueen as Hayden leads with the Slowbro, both switching out as George goes into Goodra and Hayden into his Porygon 2. Goodra decides to set up the rain as Hayden T-Waves, which is good for George because the Goodra has hydration, so that paralysis from T-Wave is immediately going to go away. Goodra then goes for the Thunder, but Porygon 2 is a Porygon 2 and doesn't take that much damage from it, and crits Goodra with an Ice Beam, dealing a little bit over half. Goodra then goes for the Rest and gets back to full as Hayden T-Waves predicting a switch. Goodra then does wake up just due to the hydration, and then he switches out. George then switches out into Scizor as Porygon 2 just goes for another Ice Beam, and then this is where a little bit of the fun happens as George then sets up a substitute as Porygon 2 goes for another T-Wave. Scizor then sets up a Swords Dance as Hayden switches into Torterra, and then on the following turn, the Scizor goes for Baton Pass and goes into Mega Lopunny. So with the substitute up and a +2 attack, there's a Mega Lopunny on the field. However, the Torterra did go for Earthquake, which does break that sub. So now there's just a +2 Mega Lopunny on the field. Still pretty scary. Mega Lopunny goes for Fake Out, which does over half to Torterra, and then is followed by a Last Resort. So after taking out the Torterra, Hayden sends in Slowbro, thinking that maybe it can live a Last Resort, but nope, the Mega Lopunny takes that out with Last Resort as well. Porygon 2 comes in, and the exact same thing happens. So Last Resort, just 3 turns in a row, takes out 3 different Mons. Then Hayden sends in his Tornadus, knowing it can outspeed, and hits it with an Acrobatics, but did not kill the Mega Lopunny, and that also dies to a Last Resort. Breloom then comes in, threatening out the Mega Lopunny with a Mach Punch, but instead goes for Spore on the Scizor that did come in. George basically wanted to get as many kills as possible with Mega Lopunny and not letting it die, just to try to move it up the MVP race. Didn't want to let the Mega Lopunny go down. George then switches into Nidoqueen as Breloom sets up a substitute, but the Nidoqueen outspeeds, breaks the substitute with a Sludge Wave as the Breloom goes for Leech Seed. Nidoqueen then just kills the Breloom with another Sludge Wave as Hayden sends in his last Pokemon, which is an Exploud. George lets his Nidoqueen go down to the Exploud just so he can get a free switch into his Mega Lopunny. And one last time, we see Fake Out, Last Resort for the final kill on Hayden's team. So that was a beautiful finish.
Yeah, like you said, that was an absolutely beautiful match. To put this in perspective, Last Resort is a base 140 move, and from a normal type like Mega Lopunny, it is Sab. So Mega Lopunny was basically hitting Hayden with a +2 physical version of Boom Burst coming off an adamant Mega Lopunny. So you can imagine how insanely hard that's going to hit. Not many physical hits can OHKO a Slowbro, especially non-super effective physical hits, and that is just the power of Last Resort and the power of Mega Lopunny. So again, this was an extremely fun match to watch, and I'm sure George's season ended exactly how he wanted to. Moving on, we have the match between John and the New Orleans Pelipers and Crimson of the Detroit Steel Wings. John brought his Sawk, Hydreigon, Raikou, Donphan, Reuniclus, and Virizion. On Crimson side, we have Latios, Roserade, Suicune, Dusclops, Crocodile, and Cradily. To start off the match, John is going to lead with his Reuniclus, and Crimson leads with his Cradily. Cradily is going to set up the Stealth Rocks as Reuniclus misses a Focus Blast. Not a super huge deal because this was a specially defensive Cradily. It would have been able to take it relatively well. John then predicts Crimson to switch out into his Dusclops and goes for the Shadow Ball, dealing about 30%. Crimson then goes back out into his Cradily and tanks the Shadow Ball easily, only does about 15%. Crimson, suspecting this to be the Assault Vest Regenerator Reuniclus John has brought to multiple matches, goes for the Toxic, but unfortunately misses, and is hit with the Psyshock, which deals about 35%. John, now not wanting his Reuniclus to be toxic, pulls the switch into Hydreigon as Crimson goes for the recover and brings his Cradily back to full health. Hydreigon then goes for the U-turn on the Cradily, dealing about 30% to it, and goes out into his Sawk, which then takes the Toxic instead. John then, predicting potentially Dusclops to come in, goes for the knockoff and deals massive damage to the Cradily because this is a choice-banded Sawk, but unfortunately is unable to kill the Cradily with another knockoff because of the Giga Drain damage that the Cradily was able to hit on the Sawk, as well as the fact that it does not have an item anymore, so knockoff will be doing less. John then pulls a hard switch into his Virizion as Cradily once again goes for the recover, bringing it to a decent amount of HP. Crimson's only real switch into this is his Latios, which even then takes 40% from a Life Orb close combat. After this, Latios is going to go for the Dragon Pulse on the incoming Reuniclus, deals some damage but not too much because again this is an Assault Vest Reuniclus. And then John reveals the Future Sight on Reuniclus, which is really cool to see, as the Cradily comes in. Cradily goes for another Toxic, hoping that John will stay in, but not wanting his Reuniclus to be toxic, goes back out into his Sulk, which of course is already poisoned. Now John is not going to overpredict, he goes right for the close combat, and the Cradily is going to go straight down. This is unfortunately for Crimson, because Cradily was actually a pretty good stop to most of John's team. Also something to note, the Future Sight here kind of goes to waste, but it did partially prevent Crimson from switching out, so it was worth it in the end. Dusclops is then going to come in on the Sawk, knowing that Sawk is choice-banded. John simply tries to sack Sawk and goes for the close combat on the Dusclops, as the Dusclops actually reveals Calm Mind, which is very dangerous for John, because now he is forced to hard switch out into his Hydreigon and hope that he can somehow take down the Dusclops. However, very unfortunately for Crimson, he is going to be hit by two Dark Pulses, the first one flinching it, and then the second one critting it, which obviously goes through the special defense boost and knocks out the Dusclops. Crimson is then going to send in his Roserade, trying to pick off the Hydreigon with the Dazzling Gleam. However, John switches into his Sawk, which just goes down to the Stealth Rocks. John then gets a free switch into his Reuniclus and clicks Shadow Ball on the incoming Crocodile. He wanted to make the prediction, didn't at this point. Not a super huge deal because he is still up at this point. John then, not having too much to switch into this, sends in his Hydreigon as Crocodile goes for the knockoff and gets rid of the Hydreigon's Choice Scarf. John then decides to go for the U-turn as Crimson switches in his Latios, so Hydreigon U-turns out on the Latios into his Raikou, as the Latios reveals to be Choice Scarfed, outspeeding the Raikou and hitting it with a Psyshock before going down to the HP Ice. Now Crimson is going to send in his Crocodile and goes for the knockoff on incoming Donphan on John's side, which does not do too much damage. Donphan is very physically bulky. On Crimson's side, he's going to send in his Suicune on Donphan's Earthquake, which it is able to tank very well. John then goes back out into his Assault Vest Reuniclus, which takes the Scald very well, and fortunately for him, does not burn. At this point, John is looking to make the big prediction. He goes for the Focus Blast as Crocodile is going to come in, and it clean goes down, so a big threat to John's team is now down. Suicune is going to come back in now, and hits the Reuniclus with a Shadow Ball, as Reuniclus does go for the Future Sight. Doesn't do too much damage to Reuniclus, but he does get the special defense drop, which is fortunate for Crimson. John now looks at his team and realizes that Donphan is not going to do too much for him, so he does send in the Donphan and sacks it off to the combination of a Shadow Ball plus Scald from the Suicune. However, after the Donphan does go down, Suicune is going to be hit by the Future Sight, and it deals about 43%, meaning that Virizion can come in and clean up the Suicune with Leaf Blade, and then follow up with the kill on Roserade with Zen Headbutt, leading to a 4-0 win for John and the New Orleans Pelipers.
Yeah, luck was really not on the side of Crimson this week, but once again we see Reuniclus just being a really, really hard thing to take down. And it's a pretty straightforward game from there. So the last match that we're going to talk about is going to be Steve and the Milwaukee Sawsbuck
Just one single block.
Just one. Uh, so the last match that we're going to be talking about is going to be Steve and the Milwaukee Sawsbucks going against Nips and the Long Island REGIROCKIES. Steve is going to lead off with his Heatran as Nips leads off with the Excelgor. Steve just decides to go for a Lava Plume as Nips just straight switches out into his Chansey, and it doesn't do much damage, but it does get burned. Steve then decides to switch into his Shaman as Chansey then sets up Stealth Rocks. Steve then decides to go for the substitute with the Shaman as Nips sends out his Gengar. So with the substitute up, Steve knows that he can at least get one kill, goes for the Zen Headbutt, but as we've seen in the past, Steve's luck does not come through for him, and he misses the Zen Headbutt as Gengar is able to take out the sub. And knowing that Gengar outspeeds, Steve knows that he can't stay in with Shaman, and unfortunately is not able to get any kills in that chain of events there. Nips then switches into Scrafty, expecting the Heatran to come in, but Steve predicts him to predict that and goes into Conkeldurr. Scrafty then goes for the Drain Punch as Conkeldurr goes for the knockoff, getting rid of the Life Orb, thinking that something else might come in, but still was pretty good to get rid of a Scrafty's Life Orb. Steve then goes for the double knockoff, predicting Gengar to come in, predicting Nips not to expect a double knockoff. So that's what he does. He goes for a knockoff. Gengar just straight up dies to that knockoff. And Scrafty comes back in, getting off Intimidates each time, slowly luring Conkeldurr's attack. And then Scrafty then goes for the knockoff and knocks off Conkeldurr's Assault Vest. And Conkeldurr goes for the Drain Punch and almost kills the Scrafty, but the Scrafty lives on like 1 to 2 HP. Excelgor then comes in to take the expected Mach Punch, which Steve does go for Mach Punch, and doesn't really take that much damage. Nips then sets up Spikes with the Excelgor, as Steve just goes for a knockoff, but the Excelgor reveals Sticky Hold, so its item is not knocked off, and it doesn't do a ton of damage. And then Nips then just goes into a Scrafty, gets another Intimidate off, and just sacks the Scrafty to a Poison Jab. And then gets to switch into his Feraligatr and basically trying to get some sort of mini sweep going on. Nips goes for the Dragon Dance as Steve switches into the Rotom Wash. Feraligatr goes for the Crunch on the Rotom Wash, does a lot of damage. Rotom Wash just Volt switches out into the Conkeldurr, which combination of the two is able to kill the Feraligatr. Diggersby comes in and hits the Conkeldurr with a quick attack. As Steve went for Mach Punch, which was not able to take out the Diggersby, and Steve decides to let Conkeldurr go down to that Diggersby, which goes for another quick attack, and then just gets the switch into Mesprit. He then goes for Psychic as Chansey switches in, not taking much damage from a Psychic. Steve then decides to set up Rocks as Chansey then hits it with a Seismic Toss. Steve then decides to switch out into Heatran as Nips switches into Excelgor, and then Nips goes for the final Gambit, but it's at such low HP that it really doesn't do anything to Heatran. Nips then goes into Diggersby, but does realize that he is not able to win and basically ends the match there. So the final turns didn't play out, but it does end up being a 5-0 victory for Steve and the Milwaukee Sawsbucks.
Yes, due to the forfeit at the end from Nips, Steve is going to be awarded the 5-0 victory. There's not really too much to go over here. Steve was playing very well. He made the first over prediction going for knockoff as Scrafty did stay in, but nailed the second prediction perfectly as Nips didn't expect that double knockoff, goes for the double knockoff, and was easily able to take out the Gengar, which was a very big threat to Steve's team. So that is all the matches we have to cover. Moving on, we are going to go over the league leaders in kills, deaths, and differential. The final result of the league leaders, as this was the last match of the regular season. Starting off with its extremely powerful performance this week, we have Mega Lopunny of the San Francisco Arcaniners with 23 kills, 5 deaths, and a plus 18 differential. After that, we have Mega Pinsir still holding up strong of the San Francisco Gieinteis with 20 kills, 3 deaths, and a plus 17 differential. After that, we have Manaphy of the Boston Red Sox with 18 kills, 9 deaths, and a plus 9 differential.
And rounding out the top 10, we do have Mega Manectric for the Cincinnati Loudreds having 16 kills, 9 deaths for a plus 7 differential. Followed by Mega Absol of the Borussia Donphans with 15 kills, 4 deaths, and a plus 11 differential. Landers Eye, also on the Borussia Donphans, has the exact same kill to death ratio, 15 kills, 4 deaths, and a plus 11 differential. Then we have in 7th, Entei for the San Francisco Giantes, having 14 kills, 7 deaths, a plus 7 differential. Salamence for the St. Louis Rampardos with 14 kills, 8 deaths, and a plus 6 differential. Rounding it out, we have Sharpedo of the New York MANKEYS for 14 kills, 9 deaths, and a plus 5 differential. And Reuniclus for the New Orleans Pelicans with 12 kills, 6 deaths, and a plus 6 differential.
Yep, Sharpedo with its massive sweep this week is landing itself in the top 10. Reuniclus has been doing relatively well all season and has also earned its place on the top 10. So congratulations to those two. I'm sure they're very excited about being in the top 10. But with that being finished, we are now going to move on to next week's matches, though it is going to be a little bit different because we obviously are done with the regular season. We are now just going to be covering the playoff matches. If you guys don't know, the playoff match is basically determined by seed. Whoever, we have seeds of 1, 2, 3, and 4. First seed plays the number 4 seed, and the 2 seed plays the number 3 seed. So the first match that we're going to be going over is the match between the first seed Miguel and the 4th seed Malvone. I am going to give this match to Miguel of the Real Maril. Even though Malvone did end the season on a hot streak, which is basically how he was able to work his way into the playoffs, Miguel has been playing very well recently, even though he did just come off of a forfeit this week. I feel like part of that was to not show off his strategy to Malvone, not having to play him basically 2 weeks in a row. So I think he is going to come up with a very clever strategy that will throw Malvone very far off guard.
Yeah, I think this could be a really interesting match to see. I would also pick Miguel to win, mostly just based on his proven track record in the playoffs, specifically last season. So as long as Miguel keeps playing like Miguel, I don't think there's a reason to pick against him yet. The next match in the playoffs is going to be Nick and the Boston Red Sox going up against George and the San Francisco Arcaniners. And this is going to be an absolutely fantastic match. And this one, it's really, really hard to decide. So if I had to pick one, I would probably pick George, but this game could really come down to either one. And I think it's just going to be who preps the best, who plays the best, and who can get in the other person's head the best. But yeah, this is going to be a really fun match to see.
Yeah, you said it perfectly. This is going to be a very fun match to see. There are big threats on both teams to each other. It looks like Manaphy is a very big threat to George. Gothitelle is a huge threat to Nick. I really think this match is going to depend on how George uses his Gothitelle, what he's going to use to trap it. Nick does have certain things that the Gothitelle would be perfect at eliminating, for example, the Nidoking, for example, potentially the Manaphy even. So I really think this match is going to be decided on that. Otherwise, this is an extremely close match, and it's very difficult for me to call. I'm going to give the slight edge to Nick. In the Kanto Conference bracket, we have the 1 seed Lars going up against the 4 seed being Dan. These two coaches have, I believe, a 1-1 record against each other. Dan beat Lars the first time, and then Lars was able to pull out a win the second time. This is going to be very difficult for me to call. I am actually going to give this one to Dan. Normally I would be giving this one to Lars because I feel like he's been a little bit more consistent over the season, but after watching Dan at the end of his match versus Tup, he was hyped, he was excited, he looked pumped up, and he looks like he's ready to win. So, although I believe Lars has been, like I said, a little bit more consistent, I feel like Dan is about to go on a really good hot streak.
Yeah, when I first looked at this match, I wanted to lean towards Lars, but I think this match is going to have a lot to do with who gets in the other person's head and who just comes up with some crazy strategy to just throw off their opponent, and just kind of using a reference of how Dan has played against Shady, specifically last season, where when he plays the same person over and over, he starts to kind of understand what his opponent wants to do, and I think Dan's going to be able to do that, and like you said, I think he does have the drive to really pull off a really big run here, and I think he's just going to come up with some really crazy things that might throw Lars off, and I think that might get him a victory. And we move on to the final match, which is going to be between the number 2 seed Fizz and the Atlanta Hawluchas, and the number 3 seed John and the New Orleans Pelipers. And this is going to be a fun match, as I I feel like Fizz has been holding out for a couple weeks, not wanting to reveal all the cards in his hand. And if I had to pick one of these two to win, I would have to ride the Fizz train because he's been doing well all season, and the times he has lost, he claims he has not been, really putting forth his full effort. So now that it's playoffs and now that it's time to really put forth your best effort, I really think Fizz is going to do that, and it's going to be really hard to stop Fizz in these playoffs.
This is another extremely close one to pick. Like we said, this is the playoffs. These are the top teams in each division, so the competition is going to be extremely stiff. I'm going to agree and narrowly give the edge to Fizz. John has been doing extremely well recently, and Fizz slacking off a little bit, but it did look like Fizz was just kind of having fun with his sets, bringing like a no attacks, quiver pass, Venomoth into a belly drum Chestnut. It wasn't quiver pass, it was agility pass, but this is going to be very difficult for me to call. I'm going to give this one to Fizz because I feel like his team is a little bit... he can do a little bit more with his team. John, for most of the season, has been bringing similar sets that have worked. For example, I believe he's brought Regen, Assault Vest, Reuniclus almost every week. So not to saying that John is uncreative, but Fizz has been a little bit more creative with his sets. If John decides to innovate a little bit, then I definitely think he can win, but I am going to give a very slight edge to Fizz of the Atlanta Howluchas. Okay, that is going to wrap up the Week 12 weekly recap. Thank you guys very much for watching. Thank you guys for supporting us the entire season. It has really been a blast to come out and be an analyst for you guys. We know that we've made mistakes throughout the season. We know that we've pissed off some of the fans at times, but having you guys come out and support the show every single week means a lot. Even if you only appeared for this one, even if you only showed up to a couple, we thank you very much nonetheless. Thank you guys for supporting the GBA. My name is Monatui.
My name is Fyro.
And we'll see you next season.